History remembers the artillery, the thunder of 1914, the industrial rhythm of machine guns. That was the official war. Loud, mechanical, impersonal. But underneath the barrage, a second war emerged. A war of silence, of sharpened shovels, brass knuckles, and knives in the dark. The trench raiders. This was not part of the plan. When the conflict began, the general staffs of Europe did not know the term trench raider. It did not exist in the manuals. It was not taught in the academies. Before this tactic was born in mud and blood, the great powers believed in a clean war, a war of beautiful uniforms, straight lines, and geometric order. But to reach the reality of the raiding party, millions had to die by the old rules. This is the story of that collapse. In 1914, the French General Staff believed that morale outweighed physics. They didn't just teach tactics, they preached a national religion. The central dogma was the offensive, the absolute belief that sheer will could overcome a machine gun. This wasn't logic, it was the trauma of 1871 demanding redemption. After the humiliation by Prussia, the empire refused to look defensive. The theory was noble. Bright uniforms elevate the fighting spirit. The reality was mathematical. Red trousers are the perfect focal point for a sniper scope. Reformers begged for muted tones. They pointed to the industrial reality of modern combat. But the establishment pushed back. To hide the soldier was to admit fear. This stubbornness would cost the nation more than the entire financial debt of the previous century. The Minister of War stood before the chamber and killed the proposal to change the uniform. Why carry a weapon 6 feet long? To pierce a cavalryman in the saddle. A tactic for a war that had already ended. The physical embodiment of this doctrine was a bayonet the size of a short sword. The French Lebel Model 1886 defined the era. Fitted with its blade, the rifle transformed into a spear. Total length, 1.8 meters. Taller than the average conscript holding it. The blade alone was 20 inches of cruciform steel. X-shaped cross-section, designed to punch through thick wool coats. It was an industrial pike. Germany responded to the threat. The Gewehr 98, a 19-inch blade. Total reach, 5'9". This was an arms race measured in centimeters. The philosophy was medieval. Reach means survival. Stab the enemy before he enters your guard. French manuals dictated the formation, elbow to elbow. A dense wall of men. Maximum shock. Zero maneuverability. But the terrain of 1914 was not a parade ground. In the narrow confines of a trench, the weapon became a trap. A soldier tries to turn. The muzzle scrapes the clay wall. The stock jams against the support beam. He is holding a lance in a telephone booth. The glint of 50 centimeters of polished steel gave away positions from a kilometer away. The Germans respected the lethality of the design enough to give it a specific nickname, the French needle. The doctrine of the bayonet charge died the moment the French army crossed into Alsace-Lorraine. They advanced as if on parade. Blue coats, bright red trousers visible against the green fields. Regimental bands played. Officers led from the front with drawn swords, chasing the ghosts of Napoleon. Then the German machine guns opened up. The music drowned in the mechanical rattle of belt-fed fire. Modern industrial warfare does not respect courage. It respects volume of fire. The infantry never got within stabbing range. The bright uniforms became target markers. Artillery and barbed wire turned the offensive into a meat grinder. By sunset, the fields were paved with red wool. Imagine the population of a small city, wiped out between breakfast and dinner. That was the scale of the massacre on August 22, 1914. France lost 27,000 men in 24 hours. France was bleeding. But Crown Prince Wilhelm decided to repeat their mistake with German pedantry. First Battle of the Marne. The prince ordered 100,000 men to fix bayonets. A massive gray wave surging into the night. It was a catastrophe. French 75s tore through the packed infantry. Panic set in. In the absolute darkness, German units opened fire on their own comrades. 15,000 casualties littered the field by sunrise. Frontal attacks were suicide. So the armies tried to go around. They sprinted north in the race to the sea, but the sky had eyes. Primitive aircraft circled overhead. Aerial reconnaissance stripped away the fog of war. Every secret maneuver was spotted. Every surprise attack became a simple math problem. How do you outflank an enemy when the front line hits the ocean? You don't. You have to dig. The survivors dropped their rifles and drove their shovels into the wet clay. In this positional hell, utility became an accusation. 29 double teeth ran along the spine of the blade. Berlin issued them to pioneer units and engineers. They used the serrated edge to cut brushwood for artillery positions or saw through timber for bunkers. A simple tool for a complex war. But the Allies saw something else. Propaganda turned a wood saw into a symbol of Teutonic barbarism. Newspapers claimed the teeth were designed to tear internal organs. The reality was less dramatic and more dangerous for the user. In the frenzy of a trench raid, the sawback was a liability. The serrated metal snagged on heavy wool tunics. It jammed between ribs. You couldn't pull it out fast enough for a second strike. Yet the myth was stronger than the mechanics. German troops knew that being captured with a sawback meant summary execution by vengeful Allied infantry. Fear overrode regulations. Before the next offensive, soldiers took files to the metal and ground the teeth down to smooth steel. 4 million men, dead or wounded, in just 5 months. The war had frozen into a scar stretching from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border. 440 miles. That is the distance from London to Zurich. A solid wall of mud and wire. Tactics were dead. There were no flanks to turn. How do you break a line that has no end? The High Command's answer was simple. You don't break it. You erase it with explosives. When hate failed to move the map, the generals turned to industry. They summoned the god of war, artillery. The doctrine was mathematical. Bombard the enemy for days. Sometimes a full week of continuous thunder. The goal was total pulverization. High explosives to snap the barbed wire. Shrapnel to clear the dugouts. Shockwaves to silence the machine guns. The infantry was promised a walk in the park. They were told to simply march across no man's land and occupy the void. That was the calculation. Theory: the shells kill everyone. Reality: the shells turn the earth over but leave the enemy alive. On paper, the solution looked flawless. 1.5 million British shells were supposed to prove the theory. For 7 days, the artillery pounded the Somme. The generals were certain. They assumed every living thing on the other side was dead. The order to the infantry was specific. Walk. Do not run. Keep the line. They believed they were marching to occupy a graveyard. But the German defenses were not just dirt. They were engineering marvels. 40 feet deep, reinforced with concrete. While the surface turned to ash, the Germans waited underground. The 1.5 million shells barely scratched the roofs of their bunkers. The shelling stopped. The whistle blew. Thousands of British soldiers walked into the open. The Germans simply climbed up their ladders, set up their machine guns, and pulled the triggers. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. July 1st became the deadliest day in British history. Yet the waves kept coming. Any trench captured was immediately lost to a counterattack from the second line. The cost was catastrophic. Within 48 hours, the armies were back at the exact starting lines. The Somme proved that industrial slaughter was a dead end. Frontal assaults were just suicide by another name. The rules of engagement had to break. A new doctrine emerged from the mud. Small-scale raids. Hit and run. The objective was no longer to hold territory. It was to bleed the enemy. Slip in. Destroy. Slip out. Before the heavy guns could even turn, early experiments failed. But the Canadians turned this chaos into a science. They were the first to realize the uncomfortable truth. This was not a duel. It was a hunt. Soon, they would teach the German Empire the true definition of fear. To do it, they abandoned modern protocol. Soldiers reached for weapons from the Middle Ages. While generals planned mass assaults, soldiers faced a physical dead end. Why did weapons created by Europe's best engineers become a death sentence for their owners? The answer is geometry. The front line was an engineering nightmare. Trenches were 7 feet deep and capped with sandbags. German defenses dug even deeper, 10 to 12 feet into the earth. Crucially, nothing ran straight. Every line followed a strict zigzag pattern. A straight trench meant one shell killed everyone. A zigzag contained the blast to a single bay. It saved lives from artillery, but it blinded the infantry. Visibility dropped to 30 feet. In these twisting corridors, the industrial war machine broke down. Standard-issue rifles were designed for targets 300 yards away. With a bayonet attached, the weapon became a 5-foot spear. Turning a 5-foot weapon in a narrow, mud-slicked corner was impossible. The rifle became a liability. The mechanics of killing were crude. One Australian soldier drove his bayonet through a German guard. The blade passed through the body and embedded deep into a hardwood support beam. It stuck fast. The Australian had to detach the lock mechanism and leave the enemy pinned to the wall. The technology forced a lethal symmetry. Recovery teams frequently found pairs of opposing soldiers slumped together, both dead from simultaneous bayonet strikes. When 20th century technology failed, the trenches reverted to the 14th century. The deadlock demanded a new tool. In the workshops behind the lines, soldiers created it. A trooper would take a standard pickaxe handle. He sawed it down to 18 inches. Then he hammered heavy hobnails through the grain in a spiral pattern. Others wired empty Mills bomb casings to the top of wooden batons. The result was a medieval morning star. On the training grounds, the sound was distinct. A dull, wet thud of wood and iron striking a straw dummy. The irony was absolute. A Lee Enfield rifle cost the British Empire significant capital. These clubs cost nothing. The most advanced industrial nations on Earth were officially arming their troops with bludgeons. But the United States industrialized the brutality. They introduced the Mark I. Official designation, trench knife. Reality, a set of brass knuckles welded to a double-edged dagger. The design was specific. The guard protected the hand. The spikes on the knuckles prevented the enemy from grabbing the wrist. The pommel ended in a heavy, protruding nut. The technical manuals labeled it a skull crusher cap. It was not a metaphor. Before a raid, the men prepared the steel. They took lampblack or mud and coated the shining blades until they were matte. The metal vanished in the dark. Even a club required assembly. The perfect weapon was already on the belt. Standard issue rifle, 4 kilograms, unwieldy in a narrow ditch. Entrenching tool, 1 kilogram. Soldiers ground the edges. It became a razor-sharp axe. The physics favored the spade. A bayonet wedges into the ribcage. It takes seconds to dislodge. A shovel shears bone and keeps moving. Optimization of offense forced an evolution in defense. Commanders looked to the 14th century. Germany deployed steel breastplates, heavy, static, only for machine gunners. The Americans tested the Brewster body shield, 40 pounds of chrome nickel steel. Technically, it worked. The alloy stopped rifle fire. Practically, it was a cage. Movement was impossible. The War Department reviewed the field tests and scrapped the project. The heavy armor was scrapped, but the clubs remained. With medieval tools in hand, the armies forged a modern tactic. How do you break a deadlock without a million shells? The answer was silence. The paradigm shifted. Generals stopped looking at maps of corps-level movements. They focused on 5 men in the dirt. No artillery prep, no whistle signals. The machine guns that erased battalions could not target what they could not see. The raiders didn't level the wire. They snipped a single gap, just wide enough for one man. The goal was not an entire front. It was one specific trench bay. Kill the sentry, grab the prisoner, vanish. It was the concept of special forces born in the mud. Surprise was the only armor they had, but perfect raids were a myth. But the high command demanded more than just captured maps or prisoners. They wanted to murder peace itself. Historians estimate that on 70% of the Western Front, the war had quietly stopped. The live and let live system ruled the trenches. Germans didn't shell latrines. The British didn't fire during breakfast. It was a pragmatic, unauthorized armistice. Generals hated it. They believed silence eroded the offensive spirit, so they ordered raids specifically to provoke retaliation. A midnight slaughter guaranteed that the next morning's breakfast would be interrupted by mortar fire. It forced the infantry back into the meat grinder. To restart the killing, the soldiers had to stop being human. In the dugout gloom, men took burnt cork and brown grease. They smeared it over their skin until their features vanished. The air smelled of carbon and rancid fat. Every shiny object was stripped. Brass buttons were cut off. They pulled on thick rubber gloves, not for warmth, but to handle the wire without a sound. The raid was not a battle. It was a precise injection of chaos. Enter, kill, leave before the enemy reserves could wake up. The strict operational limit was 20 minutes. While the European powers were still theorizing about infiltration, one Dominion army was already turning the dirty work into an art form. February 28, 1915. 100 men of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry went over the top. This was the first major organized raid of the war. They didn't want land. They wanted chaos. They tore up 30 yards of German trenches and returned. 5 men died, but the experiment worked. By autumn, the method was perfected. November 17th, Petite Douve Farm. 170 volunteers, the equivalent of a full infantry company, prepared to move. They rehearsed for 10 days. Scouts mapped every inch of the wire. Before the jump-off, the raiders stripped. No unit patches, no letters home. If captured, they were ghosts. 2:30 in the morning. Heavy rain lashed the mud. German sentries huddled inside their dugouts to stay dry. The trenches looked empty. Suddenly, the darkness exploded. Muzzle flashes lit up the rain like strobe lights. The Canadians were already inside the perimeter. It was a massacre in a phone booth. The raiders grabbed intelligence documents and new rubber gas masks. Then they vanished back into the night. The score was lopsided. 30 Germans dead, 12 prisoners taken. Canadian losses, 1 man. And even he was not killed by the enemy, but by a stray Canadian bullet. But between the plan and the target lay the deadliest strip of geography on Earth. A raider did not walk, he crawled. He dragged himself through a nightmare of mud, water-filled craters, and rotting corpses. Inch by inch, patience was the only armor. In some sectors, this dead zone stretched for hundreds of yards. In others, the distance to the enemy line was less than a football field. The first wall was the wire, 30 feet deep, 5 feet high. A rusted thicket of iron stakes and barbs. Defenders hung empty tin cans on the strands. One accidental touch caused a rattle. One rattle brought the machine guns. But the ultimate weapon was light. Artillery fired star shells high above the trenches. Small parachutes deployed, igniting magnesium flares. The environment shifted instantly. Total darkness turned into a glare brighter than the midday sun. To run was to die. To look up was to die. Wet eyes reflected the light, signaling snipers in the dark. The raider had one option. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressed his face into the mud, and froze. What happens when 2 enemy patrols stumble into each other in the pitch black? Sometimes, absolutely nothing. The raider freezes. A silhouette materializes 3 feet away. He can hear the rasp of terrified breathing, the metallic click of a safety catch. Usually, this ends in a brutal knife fight in a mud-slicked crater. Knuckles, trench clubs, and adrenaline. But sometimes, logic overrides instinct. Both sides knew the equation. One gunshot triggers a chain reaction. The listening posts, forward pits dug 50 yards into no man's land, signal the alarm. Flares burst overhead. Machine guns sweep the zone. Nobody goes home. Veterans knew to read the void. If the German lines went silent, no star shells, no random sniper fire, it wasn't safety. It meant their hunters were out on the prowl too. So tonight, the shadow lowers his rifle. The raider lowers his. They vanish into the fog without a sound. That quiet vanished with the pin of the first grenade. It tumbled down the dugout stairs. The explosion was muffled, but the chaos was total. The raid itself was a spasm of violence. Kill the sentries, destroy the equipment, grab a prisoner. But the extraction was where adrenaline turned into panic. The element of surprise was gone. Flares turned the night into a blinding strobe. Machine guns swept the zone at knee height. Raiders dragged screaming Germans through the mud. They carried their own wounded. It was slow. It was loud. 30% of all raid casualties happened on the way back. Disorientation set in. In the dark, every crater looked the same. The raider saw a trench line ahead. It looked like safety. He vaulted over the sandbags with a gasp of relief. He landed on the duckboards. He looked up. The bayonets pointing at his chest were German. Surviving the enemy trench was only half the equation. In 1917, the return trip often killed more men than the raid itself. The danger lay in the mechanics of the watch. A password system theoretically protected the returning squad. But shifts changed. A new sentry took the post without the briefing. He sees a silhouette rise from the mud. He hears the nervous rattle of a bolt action in the dark. He fires. Friendly fire was not an accident. It was a byproduct of the chaos. This waste of life served a disconnected hierarchy. Orders came from headquarters 30 miles behind the lines. Officers in safe chateaus traded platoons for minor intelligence updates. They demanded a prisoner or a map check. The cost was irrelevant. If the raid failed, command simply sent another. Many operations disappeared from the records because not a single soldier returned to report them. While command remained paralyzed, soldiers found a solution in raw American brutality. Why did the German general staff panic over a simple shotgun? 6 shots, 2 seconds. The Winchester Model 1897 brought industrial slaughter to the trenches. It possessed a mechanical flaw turned feature: slam fire. The weapon lacked a trigger disconnector. The soldier held the trigger down. He slammed the fore-end back. The action closed and fired instantly. He slammed it again. Another roar. In a 3-foot-wide trench, this wasn't marksmanship. It was a wall of lead. The thunder of the 12-gauge became the sound of inevitable death for German stormtroopers. The efficiency was so absolute, it triggered a diplomatic crisis in Berlin. The German government issued a formal protest. They declared the shotgun a war crime. Berlin threatened to execute any American prisoner captured with a weapon or even a single shell. Here lies the irony of 1918. The empire that introduced chlorine gas complained about unnecessary suffering. The army that invented the flamethrower called the shotgun inhumane. Washington did not apologize. General Pershing's staff replied with a counter-threat that silenced the diplomatic channels. If Germany executed prisoners for carrying shotguns, the United States promised specific and immediate reprisals. Berlin did not rely solely on diplomatic notes to solve the trench stalemate. German engineers answered the American shotgun with pure mechanical density. The British had their Webley revolvers. The Americans swore by the Colt M1911. Functional, reliable, but they fired one round at a time. The German response was the MP-18, 9mm, 400 rounds per minute. A stormtrooper did not just carry a gun, he carried a suppression system. The weapon pulled to the left, weighed down by the heavy snail drum magazine. Inside the steel housing sat 32 rounds. In the narrow clay corridors of the Western Front, this was absolute dominance. 1 burst cleared a traverse, 2 bursts cleared a bunker. This was the industrialization of the knife fight. Logistics limited the carnage. Only 3,000 units actually reached the combat zones before the armistice. But the architecture remained. The MP-18 provided the engineering template for every submachine gun developed in the 20th century. Even 400 rounds per minute could not save an army without a new mind. Berlin admitted the truth first. The war of attrition was lost. Sending millions into the mud was no longer a strategy, it was just accounting. The High Command took the specific violence of the trench raid and industrialized it. They formed the first official stormtrooper units. The objective shifted. Instead of pushing the entire front line, the Germans decided to pierce it. The doctrine required absolute discipline. When stormtroopers hit a concrete bunker, they didn't fight. They bypassed it. They left the strongholds for the second wave and kept running. The real target was miles behind the wire. They infiltrated the rear to hunt the nervous system of the enemy army. Artillery batteries, command posts, supply depots. Frontline defenders waited for orders that never came. The entire defensive structure crumbled from the inside. To survive this chaos, the German Empire needed a new species of warrior. A soldier authorized to ignore Berlin and think for himself. It was a managerial revolution disguised as tactics. For centuries, Prussian discipline meant blind obedience to the general staff. Now the army decentralized the war. A 22-year-old lieutenant sprints through the smog. He sees a weak point in the French line. He doesn't look for a telephone. He doesn't wait for a runner from the rear. He points his weapon and screams the order to advance. The decision cycle shrank from days to seconds. These were volunteers, mostly under 25. Former athletes with nothing to lose. They stripped off the heavy gear, no ceremonial tunics. Instead of rifles, they slung canvas sacks over their shoulders. Inside, pure high explosives. Rows of stick grenades ready for priming. Close quarters dominance required speed. The officer carried a Luger P-08 fitted with a 32-round snail drum magazine. The support team hauled the lighter MG-08/15 machine gun right into the assault wave. In the mud and sweat of the trenches, the modern concept of special forces was born. But when the magazines ran dry, they relied on primitive tools: sharpened spades, trench clubs, and fighting knives. The doctrine crossed the Alps, but in the Italian mountains, the logic of efficiency twisted into a cult of death. They called themselves Arditi, the daring ones, strictly volunteers, the best physical specimens the army could find. They stripped away the heavy gear. No rifles, just sacks of grenades and their signature daggers. Was the risk calculated? Rarely. Germany integrated these tactics into the entire army structure to save lives. Italy isolated its elite in a separate caste to spend them. The Arditi terrified the Austrians. They achieved tactical miracles in close quarters. But a nation cannot build a grand strategy on martyrs alone. The casualty rates defied mathematics. Entire raiding parties vanished into the fog of the Isonzo. Frequently, no one came back. In October 1917, a 26-year-old lieutenant proved that the new doctrine worked. His name was Erwin Rommel. He commanded a mere 150 men. He refused to feed them into the meat grinder of a frontal assault. Instead, Rommel scouted the limestone peaks and found a forgotten goat track. The unit climbed without a sound. Mist obscured their boots. They slipped past the observation posts completely unseen. Rommel struck from the rear. The Italians were facing the wrong way. Panic spread faster than the gas. 150 Germans surrounded the position and accepted the surrender of 1,500 enemies before noon. This was the Battle of Caporetto. The entire Italian front did not just retreat, it dissolved. Stormtroopers pushed 60 miles toward Venice in days. The tactic of infiltration shattered the defense. 265,000 prisoners marched into captivity. Berlin saw the success and immediately ordered the transport trains to the Western Front. With the Italian front collapsed, the Kaiser turned his gaze west. It was time for the final gamble. March 1918. 50 divisions transferred from Russia stood ready. Then, the sky tore open. 1 million shells in 5 hours. The barrage didn't just suppress the enemy, it erased the landscape. Under a cloak of heavy fog, stormtroopers vanished into British lines. They didn't charge, they infiltrated. The result was the deepest breakthrough since 1914. 40 miles of enemy territory swallowed in 2 weeks. Berlin cheered the return of mobile warfare. But the soldiers at the front were walking into a trap of their own making. Speed became the enemy. The stormtroopers outran the supply wagons, and the terrain fought back. The massive artillery barrage had turned the roads into a cratered moonscape. Trucks sank, horses died. Ammo didn't arrive. The spearhead was sharp, but the shaft had snapped. Germany traded its best blood for empty miles. The stormtrooper units led every attack. They took the highest casualties. When the dust settled, the army remained, but its elite vanguard was gone. The stormtroopers ran out of breath. The momentum died. Then the Allied counteroffensive rolled over them like a mechanized wall. 400 tanks lead the charge. It was the largest combined force the world had ever seen. The German lines didn't just bend, they evaporated. By autumn, 100,000 German soldiers were prisoners. The end came on November 11, 1918. 4 years earlier, Europe stood at the pinnacle of civilization. It was the absolute peak of technology and culture. The war introduced submarines, airplanes, and dreadnoughts. Mankind had mastered the air and the sea. But the technology didn't elevate the combat, it degraded the men. The conflict spiraled from industrial precision into something primal. In the mud of the trenches, the artillery and the machine guns eventually fell silent. When the magazines were empty, the pinnacle of progress dissolved. The war ended with men hacking at each other with wooden clubs and sharpened sapper shovels.